The elevator ride to the 50th floor felt like ascending to another planet. Zola Kincaid gripped her cleaning caddy, the plastic handle digging into her palm. She wasn't supposed to be here. This was Lena's shift, Lena's client, and Lena's high-stakes secret. But Lena was in the ER with a sick toddler, and the agency's policy was simple. Miss a black diamond client, and you never work in this city again. The doors slid open with a whisper of expensive machinery. The penthouse didn't smell like a home. It smelled like rain on cold steel and the faint, bitter scent of expensive espresso. It was a tomb made of glass and marble, overlooking a city that looked like a carpet of fallen stars. Zola moved through the foyer, her sneakers silent on the polished obsidian floors. She had a list. 3 hours to dust the gallery, sanitize the kitchen, and stay out of the master suite. Daeshim Vane was a ghost. People called him the shadow oligarch, a man who owned the satellites that watched the world but refused to be seen himself. She was finishing the East Gallery, the microfiber cloth dancing over seamless mahogany wall, when her hand brushed a knot in the wood. A soft click echoed in the hollow space. A panel shifted, receding 2 inches before sliding sideways. Zola's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Just close it," she whispered. "Zola, just walk away." But curiosity was a disease she'd caught back in journalism school, one that even poverty hadn't cured. Inside the wall wasn't a safe full of gold bars or stacks of dirty bills. It was a single, hand-carved wooden box. She reached in, her fingers trembling. The wood was warm, as if it had been held recently. She opened the lid, and the breath left her lungs. Resting on a bed of black velvet was a tarnished golden locket, shaped like a lotus flower. She knew this locket. She had seen it in her nightmares for 10 years. With a shaking thumb, she flicked the latch. Inside was a tiny, grainy photograph of a boy and a girl standing in front of a rusted gate in Busan. The girl was Zola. The boy was the brother she had been told died in a fire a decade ago, the brother whose name had been erased from every state record she'd ever tried to hack. "You're early." The voice was low, vibrating through the floorboards before it hit her ears. Zola spun around, the locket clutched to her chest. Daeshim Vane stood in the doorway. He wasn't the monster the tabloids described. He was a man in a tailored black suit, his face a mask of terrifying stillness. His eyes didn't look at her face, they looked at the golden lotus in her hand. The air in the room grew heavy, the atmospheric pressure of power. I was just dusting," Zola stammered, her voice thin. Daeshim walked toward her, each step measured and lethal. He stopped a foot away, the scent of cedar and cold air surrounding her. He didn't reach for the locket. He looked into her eyes, and for a split second, the mask broke. A flash of recognition, a decade of grief, and a sudden, violent hope. "That locket only opens for a specific biometric signature," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, soft frequency. "I've spent $12 billion trying to find the person who could trigger that sensor." He leaned down, his gaze locking hers. "Who are you?" Daeshim Vane didn't move. He didn't need to. The sheer weight of his presence pinned Zola against the mahogany wall better than any physical force could. He was searching her face, his eyes tracking the line of her jaw and the bridge of her nose with the precision of a facial recognition algorithm. "I asked you a question," he said, the softness of his voice more terrifying than a shout. "Who are you, and why did that wall open for you?" Zola's hand remained clamped over the locket. The metal was biting into her palm, a cold, sharp reminder that the ghost of her past was currently sitting in the palm of her hand. "I'm the cleaning replacement," she managed to choke out. I just touched the wood. It must be broken." Daeshim leaned closer, his shadow swallowing her. "My security doesn't break. That sensor is tuned to a very specific DNA sequence. A sequence that officially ceased to exist in a Busan laboratory 14 years ago." He reached out, not to take the locket, but to tilt her chin up. His touch was electric and icy. "You have your mother's eyes. But you have his stubbornness." Zola's pulse was a frantic drumbeat. "Who is he? What is this place?" "This place is a fortress," he whispered. "And you just walked through the front door with a key you didn't know you owned." He stepped back abruptly, the sudden distance making the air feel thin. He turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling city. 12 years ago, I was told the girl in that photograph was ashes. I spent a decade building an empire of information just to find the person who gave the order to burn you. And here you are, smelling of lemon polish and cheap detergent, standing in my living room. I don't know who you think I am, Zola said, her voice regaining its edge. The fear was still there, but the investigative spark, the one that had nearly cost her everything in school, was flickering to life. But I know this locket. My brother had the matching half. He died. Everyone I loved died. Daeshim turned back, his expression unreadable. They didn't die, Zola. They were redistributed. You were the only one who truly escaped. He walked to a sleek black console and tapped a command. The lights in the penthouse dimmed, and a holographic projection filled the air between them. It was a map of the city, dotted with hundreds of red icons. Every one of those is a person searching for the anomaly. The girl who survived the Busan Protocol. If you walk out of that elevator, you'll be picked up by a grey van before you hit the sidewalk. They won't be as patient as I am. Zola looked at the map, then at the man who seemed to know her better than she knew herself. What do you want? I want the same thing you do, Daeshim said, walking toward her until they were inches apart again. I want to know why we were the only ones left. But to find out, you have to stay. You don't clean for me anymore. You stay here, in the sky, where they can't reach you. He held out his hand. Stay, and I'll give you the names of the men who took your brother. Zola looked at his hand, the hand of a king, a ghost, a protector. She looked at the locket. Then, she reached out and took his hand. It was a deal with a devil, but he was the only devil who knew her name. The silence of the penthouse was louder than the city below. For 3 days, Zola had lived in a room that cost more than the apartment building she grew up in. The walls were soundproof, the glass was reinforced with high-tensile mesh, and the locks only turned when Daeshim Vane said so. She wasn't a prisoner, he told her. She was an asset under protection. But as she stood at the edge of the 50th floor balcony, watching the sunset bleed over the skyline, it felt like the same thing. The silk suits you better than the uniform. Zola didn't turn around. She knew the rhythm of his step now, heavy, deliberate, the gait of a man who owned the ground he walked on. She was wearing a cream-colored silk robe he'd had delivered, a far cry from the grey polyester scrub she'd worn when she first cleaned his life. Silk doesn't make me feel safe, Daeshim, she said, finally turning to face him. It just makes me feel like an expensive pet. He was standing by the bar, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. He didn't look like a tech mogul tonight. He looked like a soldier in a temporary state of rest. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the edge of a tattoo on his forearm, a series of numbers that looked like a serial code. Safety is a luxury you haven't had since you were 6 years old, he said, his voice level. I'm not asking you to be a pet. I'm asking you to be a ghost. If the world thinks you're dead, they stop looking. If they stop looking, I can work. Work on what? Finding my brother. Daeshim walked toward her, handing her the glass. Finding the men who turned him into a weapon. The locket you found wasn't just a memento, Zola. It's a key. The photo inside is embedded with a microdot containing the encrypted ledger of the Busan Protocol. Zola froze, the glass cold against her skin. You've had it all this time. Why didn't you open it? Because, he said, leaning over the railing beside her, his shoulder nearly brushing hers. It requires 2 biometric signatures to decrypt. Mine, and yours. It was designed so that neither of us could betray the other. They didn't just want us to be survivors. They wanted us to be a failsafe. Zola looked down at her hand, the hand that had triggered his vault. So you didn't save me on the sidewalk because you cared. You saved me because you needed my thumbprint. Daeshim turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting the dying light of the sun. He didn't lie. He didn't soften the blow. That was the most terrifying thing about him. I saved you because you are the only person left in this world who knows what it sounds like when the white room doors close, he whispered. But yes, I need the ledger. And once we open it, there is no going back to cleaning floors, Zola. You'll be the most hunted woman on the planet. He held her gaze, a silent challenge in the air. Are you ready to stop hiding? Zola looked at the city, then at the man who had built a cage of gold to keep the wolves away. She took a slow sip of the drink, the burn hitting the back of her throat. I stopped hiding the second I walked into this penthouse, she said. Let's open it. The decryption hadn't been an explosion. It was a slow, digital bleed. For hours, the holographic displays in Daeshim's study had been processing the microdot from the locket. Zola sat in the oversized leather chair, watching lines of Korean script and tactical maps flicker across the glass walls. You should sleep, Daeshim said, not looking up from his terminal. I can't sleep in a room where my life is being downloaded, Zola countered. She stood up, her legs stiff, and began to wander the perimeter of the study. The room was a testament to a man obsessed. One wall was dedicated to a physical map of the globe, pinned with red string and Polaroids, not of people, but of shipping containers, offshore oil rigs, and blacked-out government buildings. What is all this? She asked, stopping in front of a section labeled the Aegis Group. The people who bought us, Daeshim replied, his voice flat. They don't deal in drugs or guns, Zola. They deal in biological futures. They invest in children with specific genetic markers, wait for them to grow, and then harvest the talent or the organs as needed. Zola felt a wave of nausea. She moved to the far corner of the room, where the light didn't quite reach. There, she saw a separate, smaller display. It wasn't a map. It was a timeline of her own life. You've been watching me, she whispered, her fingers brushing a photo of her graduation from the academy, taken from a distance. Every foster home. Every job. You were there. I was the shadow that kept the other shadows away, Daeshim said, finally standing and walking toward her. Every time a caseworker tried to move you to a facility that didn't exist on a map, a bribe was paid to keep you in the public system. Every time your tuition was mysteriously covered, it was a debt Aegis thought they were collecting from a ghost. Zola turned to him, her eyes bright with sudden fury. You played God with my life. You let me think I was alone. I spent nights wondering why my brother was gone and I was left behind, and you were just watching. I couldn't bring you here, he barked, his stoic mask finally cracking. To bring you into my world before I had the power to protect you was a death sentence. I had to become the shadow oligarch before I could become your brother's substitute. Is that what you are? A substitute? He stepped into her space, his breathing heavy. I'm the only thing standing between you and the men who are currently tracking the signal we just sent out by opening that locket. Before she could respond, a rhythmic red pulse began to throb through the room. A siren, low and haptic, vibrated in the floor. They found the handshake, Daeshim said, his eyes snapping back to the screens. The Aegis Group just breached the outer firewall. He grabbed a sleek, matte black case from the desk and shoved it into her hands. The penthouse is no longer a cage, Zola. It's a target. We leave. Now. The red pulse wasn't just a light, it was a heartbeat. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of cold marble and silent glass, had transformed into a pressurized chamber. How did they get through? Zola yelled over the rising hum of the building's defensive servers. They didn't go through the firewall, Daeshim said, his hands moving with blurred speed as he wiped the main terminals. They went through the floor. A dull, rhythmic thud vibrated through the soles of Zola's feet. It wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of magnetic breaching charges. On the 49th floor, directly beneath them, the Aegis Group was cutting a hole in the sky. Get to the service elevator, Daeshim commanded, grabbing a heavy tactical coat and throwing it over his shoulders. The main lift is already jammed. They're coming up through the vents and the floor joists. Zola gripped the black case he'd given her. What about the girl? The one in the back room? Daeshim paused, his jaw tightening. For a man who claimed to be a monster, the hesitation was a confession. Hannah is already in the extraction pod. Move, Zola. They sprinted through the darkened gallery. The expensive art on the walls felt like tombstones now. Just as they reached the foyer, the marble floor in the center of the living room buckled upward. A jagged circle of stone erupted, and 4 figures in charcoal-grey tactical gear rose from the dust like ghosts. They wore specialized HUD visors that glowed a predatory green. "Target sighted," a mechanical voice crackled. Daeshim didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of Zola, drawing a sleek, suppressed weapon from his waistband. He didn't fire like a man in a movie, he fired like a mathematician, short, calculated bursts that dropped the first 2 intruders before they could level their rifles. "Behind the counter," he roared. Zola dove behind the black granite kitchen island. Bullets chewed into the stone, sending shards of expensive rock flying like shrapnel. She saw Daeshim move, a blur of black silk and lethal intent. He didn't just protect her, he dismantled the threat with a cold, terrifying efficiency that made her realize why he was the only survivor of the Busan Protocol. He wasn't just a tech mogul. He was the project's most successful weapon. The last intruder lunged, swinging a combat blade. Daeshim caught the man's wrist, twisted, and drove him into the glass window. The reinforced pane spider-webbed but held. "Who sent you?" Daeshim hissed, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. The intruder only laughed, a wet, gargling sound. "The Aegis, always, collects." A loud crack echoed through the room, the sound of the secondary charges. The ceiling began to groan. "The roof is compromised." Zola screamed, pointing up as dust rained down. Daeshim grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the balcony. "The elevator is gone. We're taking the long way down." He clipped a carabiner to his belt and grabbed a hidden cable hidden in the balcony railing. Before Zola could protest, he wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "Hold your breath," he whispered. Then, they stepped into the abyss. The sensation of falling was replaced by a brutal, rhythmic jarring as the high-tensile wire slowed their descent. They didn't hit the ground. They swung into the open window of a blacked-out van waiting on the 10th-floor ledge of the parking garage. As the van sped into the neon-soaked arteries of the city, the adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by a cold, hollow ache in Zola's chest. Daeshim sat opposite her, his face illuminated by the flickering streetlights. He was bleeding from a shallow cut on his temple, but his hands were steady as he checked his weapon. "You said they collected us," Zola said, her voice trembling. "What was the Busan Protocol, Daeshim? No more riddles. No more shadows. Tell me the truth." Daeshim leaned back, the shadows of the passing buildings dancing across his sharp features. "It started in 2012. A joint venture between Aegis and a splinter cell of the intelligence community. They weren't looking for soldiers. They were looking for conduits." "What kind of conduits?" "Neurological synchronization," he said, the words tasting like poison. "They found that certain pairs of children, siblings or those with high genetic compatibility, could share cognitive loads. If one child learned a language, the other could speak it. If one felt pain, the other developed the antibodies to fight the trauma." Zola felt a chill that had nothing to do with the van's air conditioning. "The white rooms. We weren't just being kept there. We were being wired." "You and your brother, Minute Ho, were the gold standard," Daeshim continued, his gaze distant. "I was in the room next to yours. I was the control variable. The one they used to see what happened when a child was left alone." He leaned forward, the intensity in his eyes making Zola hold her breath. "The night of the fire wasn't an accident. I started it. I knew they were going to harvest Minute Ho the next morning because his synchronization levels had peaked. I couldn't save everyone. I could only break the locks on 3 doors." "You saved me," Zola whispered. "I pushed you into the laundry chute," he corrected, a grim smile touching his lips. "I watched you slide into the darkness, and I prayed the world would be kinder to you than the men in the lab coats. But Minute Ho, they got to him before I could reach his door." Zola reached out, her fingers brushing the serial code tattoo on his arm. "And you? How did you become this?" "I stayed," he said simply. "I let them think I was a loyal product. I climbed their ladder, learned their secrets, and waited until I could steal enough of their capital to build my own fortress. I became the shadow oligarch so I could burn Aegis to the ground from the inside." The van braked hard, swerving into an underground tunnel. "We're here," Daeshim said, his mask of stone returning. The safe house is a graveyard for people like us. But it's the only place where the signal from the locket can be fully decoded without Aegis seeing the ghost in the machine. Zola looked at the black case in her lap. And Minute Ho. Is he still one of their products? Daeshim paused, his hand on the door handle. In the Busan protocol, there is a saying, the conduit never breaks, it only changes hands. We're going to find out who's holding his hand now. The safe house was a converted Cold War bunker buried beneath an abandoned textile mill in New Jersey. It smelled of ozone and damp earth. As the heavy steel door hummed shut, Zola saw a small figure standing at the end of the long, fluorescent-lit corridor. It was a girl, no older than 8, wearing an oversized grey hoodie. She wasn't moving. She wasn't playing. She was simply staring at the concrete wall with an intensity that made the hair on Zola's neck stand up. "That's Hannah," Daeshim said, his voice dropping to a protective rasp. "I found her in an Aegis transport 3 months ago. She's the only other survivor of the new Link experiments." Zola walked toward the girl, her footsteps echoing. "Hannah." The girl didn't turn. She didn't even blink. "She hasn't spoken a word since I pulled her out," Daeshim explained, stepping up beside Zola. "The doctors say her vocal cords are fine. It's the neurological load. She's listening to a frequency we can't hear." Zola knelt beside the girl. Up close, Hannah's eyes were a startling, translucent amber, the same marker Daeshim had mentioned. Zola reached out, but hesitated. She remembered the feeling of the white rooms, the way touch always preceded pain. "Hannah," Zola whispered, her voice thick with a memory she tried to drown in lemon Polish for years. "I know the sound the doors make. I know the way the air tastes like metal." Hannah's head tilted. "Just a fraction." "Daeshim says you're listening," Zola continued. "Ignore the man watching them from the shadows. Are you listening for him? For the one who's supposed to be on the other side of the wire?" Suddenly, Hannah's hand shot out. She didn't grab Zola, she pressed her palm flat against Zola's chest, right over her heart. The girl's eyes snapped to Zola's, and for a second, the bunker disappeared. Zola felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated static. It wasn't a thought, it was a sensation. The smell of ozone intensified. A flash of a dark room. A boy's face, older, scarred, but with the same jawline as the photo in the locket. "Run," a voice echoed in Zola's mind. It wasn't Hannah's voice. It was a man's. Hannah pulled her hand away and gasped, her first breath in what seemed like an eternity. She looked at Zola, her lips trembling. He says you have the other half," Hannah whispered. Her voice was cracked, like dry earth. Daeshim was at their side in an instant, his face pale. "Hannah, who said that?" Hannah looked at Daeshim, then back at Zola. "The man in the dark. He's not dead. But he's not Minute Ho anymore. He's the processor." Zola looked at the black case on the floor. The locket wasn't just a key to a ledger. It was a beacon. And by opening it, she hadn't just alerted Aegis, she had plugged herself back into a network she had spent 14 years trying to escape. "He's coming," Hannah said, her amber eyes wide with terror. "And he's not coming to save you." The safe house was supposed to be a dead zone, a lead-lined coffin where signals went to die. But as Hannah's warning hung in the air, the monitors in the command center began to scream. Not a siren, but a high-pitched, digital shriek that sounded like a choir of glass breaking. "The location is compromised," Daeshim said, his voice dropping into a register of cold fury. "Impossible. This bunker's signature is masked by the mill's power grid." He pivoted to the wall of monitors, his fingers dancing across the keys. A schematic of the bunker appeared, but it was being overwritten by red geometric shapes, a digital infection. "Daeshim," Zola said, her voice trembling as she looked at the security feed of the tunnel entrance. "The doors are opening." "I didn't authorize that." He hit a manual override switch. Nothing happened. "The encryption hasn't been cracked. It's been handed over." Daeshim's gaze snapped to the shadows at the back of the room. Standing near the server racks was Cyrus, his lead tactical officer, the man who had been with him since the Busan escape. Cyrus wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a small, silver transmitter that was pulsing with the same red light as the monitors. "You were always too sentimental, Vane," Cyrus said, his voice devoid of the loyalty he had performed for a decade. "The shadow oligarch. You're just a boy playing with stolen toys. Aegis offered me a seat at the table. All I had to do was deliver the anomaly." "I pulled you out of the gutter, Cyrus," Daishim hissed, stepping toward him. "And you put me in a bunker," Cyrus countered. "Aegis is the future. Why be a ghost when you can be a god?" He pressed a button on the transmitter. A high-frequency pulse blasted through the room. Hannah shrieked, clutching her ears, and Zola felt a blinding pain behind her eyes, as if her brain were being scrubbed with wire wool. "The signal," Hannah gasped, collapsing to her knees. "It's him. The processor. He's in the gate." The heavy steel doors at the end of the hall buckled inward with a sickening groan of metal. Through the smoke stepped a figure that stopped Zola's heart. He wore the same charcoal tactical gear as the intruders in the penthouse, but his visor was off. His face was a map of surgical scars, and his eyes were a dull, mechanical silver. He didn't look like the boy in the locket. He looked like a machine wearing a human skin. "Minute Ho," Zola whispered, the name feeling like a sin on her tongue. The figure didn't blink. He raised a hand, and the digital shriek in the room reached a crescendo. Every light in the bunker shattered at once. "Extraction team, move in," Cyrus commanded into his radio. "Take the girl. Kill the oligarch." In the sudden darkness, the only thing Zola could see were the glowing green visors of the Aegis team entering the room and the cold, silver stare of the brother who had come to take her back to the White Rooms. The bunker was no longer a stronghold, it was a slaughterhouse. In the flickering emergency strobes, the world moved in jagged, terrifying bursts. Daishim didn't go for his gun, he went for Cyrus. The two men collided in the dark, a brutal symphony of bone hitting bone. Daishim fought with a desperate, animalistic ferocity, driven by the realization that his decade of preparation had been rotted from the inside. But Zola couldn't look away from the man at the door. Minute Ho, or what was left of him. He moved toward her with a terrifying, rhythmic gait. Every step he took seemed to sync with the digital pulse still screaming through the air. The Aegis soldiers moved around him like he was the eye of a hurricane. "Minute Ho, stop!" Zola screamed, her back hitting a cold server rack. She held the black case against her chest like a shield. "It's me. It's Zola." The figure paused. His head tilted, a mechanical mimicry of the way Hannah had tilted hers. For a split second, the silver light in his eyes flickered, replaced by a flash of human brown. His lips moved, but no sound came out, only a static-filled hiss through the comms mic on his collar. "Run." It was the same word Hannah had channeled. He wasn't there to capture her. He was fighting the very hardware wired into his brain just to give her a second of lead time. "Minute Ho. Zola, move." Daishim's voice cracked through the chaos. He had slammed Cyrus into a console, his hands bloody. He lunged across the room, grabbing Zola by the harness of her tactical vest and swinging her toward the ventilation shaft behind the server racks. "I'm not leaving him." "That isn't your brother." Daishim roared, firing a blind volley toward the approaching soldiers. "That's a remote access node. If he touches you, the link will fuse, and they'll have both of you forever." Aegis soldiers opened fire. The safe house was being reduced to dust and flying sparks, a garden of ashes. Daishim shoved Hannah into Zola's arms. "Go! There's a sub-level exit through the cooling vents. It leads to the river." "What about you?" Daishim looked at the processor, the boy he had failed to save in Busan, now a monster coming to claim the girl he had managed to hide. He pulled a small, black detonator from his pocket. "I'm going to finish the fire I started 14 years ago," Daishim said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Find the textile mill's old dock. A boat is waiting. The password is Lotus." He didn't wait for a goodbye. He charged into the line of fire, a silhouette of defiance against the silver-eyed ghost of their past. Zola scrambled into the vent, Hannah's small hand locked in hers, as the first of the heavy floor charges began to blow. The textile mill's old dock was a skeletal remain of a forgotten industrial age, rotting into the dark waters of the Hudson. Zola crouched in the belly of a matte black speedboat, her hands still trembling as she clutched Hannah. Behind them, the horizon was glowing. The bunker hadn't just burned, it had collapsed into a sinkhole of high-tech debris. Daeshim wasn't with them. He said he'd find us, Zola whispered, more to convince herself than the silent girl beside her. But she knew the odds. Minute Ho, the processor, wasn't just a soldier, he was a living signal jammer. Hannah looked up, her amber eyes reflecting the distant flames. "He's not dead," she said, her voice stronger now. "The shadow is still moving. But the silver man is everywhere." Zola realized then that running wasn't enough. As long as Aegis owned the satellites and the servers, there was no corner of the Earth dark enough to hide them. She looked at the black case Daeshim had shoved into her hands. It contained the decrypted ledger, the names, the bank accounts, and the biometric keys of every board member of the Aegis group. "They think I'm a cleaning lady," Zola muttered, a cold, sharp resolve cutting through her grief. "They think I'm just an asset to be collected." She opened the laptop integrated into the case. Her fingers, once used to scrubbing floors, flew across the keys. She wasn't just a journalism student. She was a girl who had survived by noticing the details everyone else missed. She didn't leak the data to the press. The press could be bought. She didn't send it to the police. Aegis was the police in half these jurisdictions. Instead, Zola initiated a Queen's Gambit. She used the ledger to trigger a series of automated, irreversible stock shorts against Aegis's shell companies. She wasn't trying to expose them. She was trying to bankrupt them in a single hour of trading. "If they want to treat us like data," Zola hissed, hitting the enter key, "then let's see how they handle a system crash." Suddenly, the boat's comms system crackled. It wasn't the Lotus password. It was a rhythmic, clicking sound, the same sound the processor had made. "Zola," a distorted voice came through the speakers. It was Daeshim, but he sounded miles away, his voice layered with digital interference. "They've moved the auction up. They're taking the freighter. You have to stop the transmission, or the data you just sent won't matter. They'll have already sold the sink to the highest bidder." "Where are you?" "I'm on the hull," he gasped. "But I can't get to the bridge. Minute Ho is, here's the firewall, Zola. He's blocking my every move." Zola looked at Hannah. The girl was already reaching for the laptop, her small hand glowing with a faint, static charge. "I can open the door," Hannah whispered. "But you have to be the one to walk through it." The auction wasn't held in a ballroom or a dark web forum. It was happening in real time, broadcast via closed-circuit satellite to the world's most dangerous bidders, hosted from the bridge of an Aegis stealth freighter anchored 10 miles off the coast. Cyrus stood on the bridge, his face bruised but triumphant. Behind him, Zola and Hannah were strapped into sink chairs, metal thrones laced with fiber-optic needles. They weren't just selling the children, they were selling the experience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cyrus addressed the camera, his voice smooth. "You aren't bidding on slaves. You are bidding on the first decentralized human processing unit. Total cognitive immersion." Zola looked across the deck. Minute Ho, the processor, stood at the center of the room, cables snaking from the base of his skull into the ship's mainframe. He was the server. She and Hannah were the data. "Minute Ho," Zola whispered, her mind beginning to fray as the needles hummed. "Look at me. Remember the gate. Remember the rusted gate in Busan." The processor's head twitched. A spark of silver static jumped between his fingertips. On the monitors, the bidding halted. A warning light flashed. "Neural instability detected. Push the sedative." Cyrus barked at a technician. Suddenly, the ship's radar let out a long, continuous wail. A single blip was moving toward them at an impossible speed. A small, high-velocity interceptor that didn't show up on standard scans. "Vane," Cyrus hissed, his grip tightening on his sidearm. "He's supposed to be at the bottom of the mill." The ship shook violently as the interceptor slammed into the freighter's hull, not firing a missile, but using itself as a kinetic slug. Moments later, the heavy blast doors of the bridge were blown inward. Daeshim Vane stepped through the smoke. He was a wreck, his suit torn, his shoulder soaked in blood, his face a mask of jagged rage. He didn't have a team. He only had a single, handheld device, the Lotus Override. The auction is closed, Cyrus, Daishim rasped, his voice echoing in the high-tech silence. Cyrus lunged for Zola, pressing a gun to her temple. One step closer and I merge her brain with the mainframe permanently. She'll be a vegetable, but the data will be mine. Daishim stopped. He didn't look at Cyrus. He looked at Minute Ho. Minute Ho, Daishim said, his voice dropping to that soft, dangerous frequency. I couldn't reach your door 14 years ago. But I'm standing at it now. Open it. The processor's silver eyes locked onto Daishim. In that moment, the three survivors of the Busan Protocol were connected in a triangle of shared trauma. Minitecho's hand moved. He didn't attack Daishim. He grabbed the thick bundle of cables connected to his own chest and ripped. The feedback was a physical wave of white light. The monitors exploded. Cyrus was thrown backward by the sheer electrical discharge. Zola felt the needles in her neck go cold as the power died. As the ship began to tilt, the shadow oligarch didn't go for the data. He didn't go for the villains. He dove for Zola, catching her before she hit the deck. "I've got you," he whispered into her hair, the same words he'd said at the laundry chute a decade ago. "I've finally got all of you." Shall we conclude this journey with Chapter 12, The New Horizon, or would you like to design the cinematic thumbnail of the three survivors finally standing together? The freighter didn't sink into the ocean. It drifted, a dead metal whale stripped of its digital soul. By the time the sun began to peek over the Atlantic horizon, the Aegis Group was a memory. The Queen's Gambit Zola had played from the boat had triggered a cascade of financial liquidations that even their highest-paid lawyers couldn't stop. Zola sat on the edge of the docking bay, her feet dangling over the churning water. She was wrapped in a thermal blanket, the weight of the golden locket heavy and warm against her chest. Daishim approached her, his movements stiff from the night's toll. He sat down beside her, the silence between them no longer filled with secrets or shadows. "The authorities are 20 minutes out," he said, staring at the sunrise. "I've scrubbed the bridge. There is no record of the link. No record of the Busan Protocol. As far as the world is concerned, this was a corporate freighter hit by an engine malfunction." "And us?" Zola asked, turning to him. "Are we still ghosts?" Daishim looked at her, his dark eyes finally clear of the hypervigilance that had defined him. "The shadow oligarch died on this ship, Zola. The assets are in a blind trust for the survivors. For the first time in 14 years, nobody is watching you. You're just Zola Kincaid. You can go back to school. You can be a journalist. You can be anything." "I don't want to go back to who I was," she said firmly. She looked toward the cabin where Hannah was sleeping, her head resting on Minitecho's lap. Minute Ho was silent, his silver eyes having faded back to a soft, human brown, though the scars remained. He wasn't the processor anymore, but he wasn't the boy from the gate either. He was something new, someone who needed time to learn how to be a person again. "We're a family," Zola said, the word feeling strange but right. "A broken, strange, multi-billion-dollar family. But we're staying together." Daishim didn't argue. He simply reached out and covered her hand with his. "I bought a place. Not a penthouse. Not a bunker. A house with a garden. In a town where the only thing people care about is the weather." Zola leaned her head on his shoulder. The sale girl who had accidentally cleaned a billionaire's penthouse was gone. In her place was a woman who had faced the shadows and come out holding the light. The locket clicked open one last time. This time, Zola didn't look at the photo of the past. She looked at the reflection of the three of them in the polished gold, scarred, tired, but finally, undeniably free. "Let's go home," she said.